Friends, what I'm about to tell you will break your heart, but I need you to hear it because 4 million children just lost access to food. Let me say that again slowly. 4 million children. Before we go any deeper into this story, I need you to do something right now. Hit that subscribe button, become a member, because what happened in that courtroom yesterday affects every single family in America, and we cannot let this story disappear into the noise. Yesterday morning, I woke up to news that made me physically sick. The Supreme Court handed down a decision that will echo through every school cafeteria, every kitchen table, every parent's worst nightmare. They allowed the Trump administration to withhold $4 billion in emergency food assistance, $4 billion that was supposed to reach families during this government shutdown. But here's what they're not telling you in the headlines. Here's what no one wants you to understand. This isn't just about numbers on a spreadsheet. This is about Emma, age 7, who told her teacher last week that her tummy hurts because there wasn't enough food at home. This is about Marcus, whose mother works 2 jobs but still can't afford groceries after paying rent. This is about your neighbors, your community, your America. And I have to ask you something, and I want you to really think about this. How did we get to a place where taking food from children became a legal strategy? How did we normalize hunger as a political weapon? I've been walking through this story all day, trying to understand how we got here. But first, let me tell you what's really happening behind those courtroom doors, what they don't want you to see. 3 months ago, something changed in Washington. Sources close to the administration started whispering about a new approach to government shutdowns. They called it targeted pressure. But what they really meant was using human suffering as leverage. And children, innocent children, became their bargaining chips. The night before the Supreme Court ruling, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about a conversation I had with a mother in Michigan 2 years ago. She told me, "Mrs. Obama, sometimes I pretend to eat so my kids think there's not enough food for me too. I can't let them know we're running out." That woman is real. Her children are real. And now because of 9 justices in black robes, her worst fears are coming true. But let me tell you something that will surprise you about this story, something the media isn't covering, something that changes everything you think you know about how this decision was made. Justice Roberts, the Chief Justice himself, was seen having a private conversation with someone unexpected 3 days before the ruling, someone whose influence on this case runs deeper than anyone realizes. I'll tell you who that was in just a moment, but first you need to understand why this conversation matters so much. Because what happened in that brief exchange explains everything about why 4 million children are now at risk of going hungry. It explains why the usual legal precedents were ignored. It explains why compassion lost to calculation. The person Justice Roberts met with, it wasn't a lawyer, it wasn't a legal scholar, it was David Chen, a little-known advisor who's been quietly shaping policy from the shadows for months. David has a theory about American resilience that would shock you. He believes that sometimes people need to suffer to appreciate what they have. Now, David would never admit this publicly. In fact, his office denied any such meeting ever took place when reporters started asking questions. But I have sources inside the court building, sources who saw this conversation happen, sources who heard what was said. And what David told Justice Roberts that day will make your blood boil. He said, and I quote from someone who was there, "These families have become too dependent on government assistance. A temporary pause in benefits will remind them to find other solutions for feeding children in the richest nation on earth." But here's where this story gets even more disturbing. David Chen isn't just some random advisor. He's the architect of what insiders call the Resilience Project. It's a systematic plan to reduce government assistance across the board by creating artificial crises that force people to, in their words, rediscover self-reliance. The food aid decision, it's just the beginning. I want you to imagine for a moment that you're 8 years old. You come home from school excited to tell your mom about your day, but when you get there, she's sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of bills and an empty refrigerator. She tries to smile, but you can see the worry in her eyes. That's the reality for millions of children right now. And while those children go to bed with empty stomachs, the people who made this decision go home to full pantries and warm dinners. This is not the America I know. This is not the America I fought for when I was First Lady. This is not the America that my daughters are inheriting. But let me tell you about the heroes in this story, because there are heroes, even in the darkest moments. Senator Elizabeth Warren spent 18 hours straight yesterday calling emergency meetings, trying to find legislative solutions. She didn't go home. She didn't sleep. She ordered pizza for her staff and kept working while children across America went without dinner. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez used her social media platform to organize grassroots food drives in 47 states. In less than 24 hours, ordinary Americans donated over $2 million worth of food and supplies directly to families in need. These are the leaders we need. These are the people who remember that government exists to serve the people, not to play games with their lives. But even as these heroes work around the clock, the damage is spreading. Food banks across the country are reporting unprecedented demand. Schools are scrambling to figure out how to feed students whose families relied on the suspended benefits. Community centers are turning into makeshift soup kitchens. And through it all, the administration's response has been silence. Here's what makes me angriest about this whole situation. It was preventable, completely preventable. The legal argument used to justify withholding this food aid is so thin, so legally questionable that even conservative legal scholars are calling it creative interpretation at best, constitutional overreach at worst. Professor Sarah Martinez from Georgetown Law told me yesterday, I've been teaching constitutional law for 25 years, and I've never seen such a weak legal foundation used to justify such devastating human consequences. But weak legal foundations don't matter when you have political will. And right now, there's a political will to use suffering as a strategy. I need to share something with you that happened to me personally yesterday. After the news broke, I decided to visit a food bank in Southeast DC. I wanted to see the immediate impact with my own eyes. What I saw there will haunt me forever. There was a grandmother named Rosa, 67 years old, standing in line with her two grandchildren. The little girl, maybe 5 years old, kept asking, Abuela, why are we waiting in this long line? Rosa didn't know how to explain to a 5-year-old that the government had decided her hunger wasn't a priority. I walked over and introduced myself. Rosa recognized me immediately and started crying. Not tears of joy or excitement, tears of shame. She was embarrassed that a former first lady was seeing her in line for free food. I took her hands and I said, Rosa, you have nothing to be ashamed of. You're doing everything right. It's the system that's broken. And that little girl, that precious 5-year-old, she looked up at me with the biggest brown eyes and said, are you here for food too? How do you explain to a child that you're not hungry, that you're not in need, when she's learning that even grown-ups sometimes don't have enough to eat? I think about that moment every few minutes, that innocent question that cuts straight to the heart of this crisis. Are you here for food too? Because the truth is, we're all here for food. We're all in this line together. When 4 million children lose access to nutrition, when families are forced to choose between medicine and meals, when grandmothers have to explain hunger to grandchildren, we all become part of this story. The ripple effects of yesterday's decision are already starting to show. Emergency rooms are bracing for an increase in malnutrition cases. Teachers are being trained to recognize signs of hunger in their students. Social workers are overwhelmed with calls from desperate parents. Dr. Jennifer Liu, a pediatrician at Children's Hospital in Los Angeles, called me this morning. She said, Michelle, I'm already seeing the stress in families. Parents are bringing in children with headaches, stomach aches, difficulty concentrating. They think it's illness, but it's hunger. It's anxiety about food insecurity. This is happening right now, today, while you're watching this video. But here's what gives me hope. Here's what keeps me fighting despite the darkness of this moment. Yesterday afternoon, as news of the Supreme Court decision spread, something beautiful started happening. Americans began taking care of each other without being asked, without waiting for government solutions, without political posturing. In Denver, a group of teenagers organized a food drive that collected 3,000 meals in 4 hours. In Atlanta, local restaurants started a Pay It Forward program that has already provided 800 free meals to families in need. In rural Montana, neighbors started a community garden sharing program that's feeding 15 families. This is the America I recognize. This is the spirit that no Supreme Court decision can touch. This is the love that no political strategy can destroy. And that's why I need you to stay with me through this story, because your voice, your action, your compassion matters more right now than it ever has before. The administration thought they could use hunger as a weapon. They thought they could force compliance through suffering. They thought Americans would blame each other instead of holding leaders accountable. They were wrong. Instead, they've awakened something powerful in this country. They've reminded us who we are when the politics are stripped away. They've shown us that our humanity is stronger than their strategy. But we can't just rely on grassroots compassion to solve this crisis. We need systemic change. We need leaders who understand that feeding children isn't a political position. It's a moral imperative. That's why the work of those Democratic senators and representatives matters so much. They're not just opposing a policy, they're defending a principle. The principle that in America, no child should go hungry because adults are playing political games. Senator Cory Booker put it perfectly yesterday when he said, if we can find money for tax cuts for billionaires, we can find money to feed children. If we can fund military operations around the world, we can fund lunch programs at home. This isn't about resources. This is about priorities. And he's absolutely right. This isn't about money. America has more than enough resources to feed every child, house every family, care for every person who needs help. What we have is a distribution problem. What we have is a priority problem. What we have is a leadership problem. The $4 billion being withheld, that's less than what we spend on military procurement in a single week. That's less than what gets lost in administrative inefficiencies every month. That's a rounding error in our national budget. But for the families affected, it's everything. It's breakfast for their children. It's dignity at the grocery store. It's the peace of mind that comes with knowing you can feed your family. I want to tell you about something else that happened yesterday that the media isn't covering, something that shows you exactly what kind of people we're dealing with. While families were learning they'd lost food assistance, while children were going to bed hungry, senior administration officials attended a $1,000 per plate fundraising dinner in downtown D.C. The irony was lost on no one except them. A server at that dinner, someone who asked not to be identified for fear of losing their job, told me they were laughing and joking while kids across the city were wondering where their next meal would come from. The disconnect was disgusting. That server was right to be disgusted. We should all be disgusted. When leadership becomes so removed from reality, so insulated from consequence, that they can celebrate while others suffer, something fundamental has broken down. But that breakdown also creates opportunity for new leadership, opportunity for new priorities, opportunity for all of us to demand better from the people we elect to serve us. Because make no mistake, they are supposed to serve us, not the other way around. And when they forget that, when they start treating public service like a game instead of a sacred trust, it's our responsibility to remind them. The 2024 election showed us something important. They showed us that Americans are paying attention. They showed us that compassion still wins when people understand what's at stake. They showed us that we don't have to accept cruelty as normal. But elections are just the beginning. Real change happens every day in every community through every act of conscience and compassion. It happens when you call your representatives. It happens when you volunteer at food banks. It happens when you refuse to let suffering become invisible. It happens when you share stories like this one, when you make sure people know what's really going on, when you keep the spotlight on decisions that affect real lives. Because here's what those who made this decision are counting on. They're counting on you to get distracted. They're counting on other news to push this story aside. They're counting on your compassion fatigue to set in before any real accountability happens. Don't let them win. Don't let the suffering of 4 million children become yesterday's news. I've been in politics long enough to know that public attention is the most powerful force for change. When people pay attention, when they stay engaged, when they demand action, leaders have no choice but to respond. But when we look away, when we assume someone else will handle it, when we let important stories fade into the background, that's when the worst decisions get made in the shadows. Right now, tonight, there are parents tucking hungry children into bed while promising them that tomorrow will be better. There are teachers planning to share their own lunches with students who haven't eaten since the day before. There are grandparents choosing between their medication and their grandchildren's meals. These aren't statistics. These aren't political talking points. These are your neighbors. These are our fellow Americans. These are the people our government is supposed to protect and serve, and they're counting on us. All of us, to not forget them, to not move on to the next crisis without solving this one, to not let their suffering become acceptable as long as it's not ours. So here's what I'm asking you to do. Right now, before you click away from this video, before you scroll to something else, before you let this moment pass, first, subscribe to this channel and share this story. Make sure other people know what's happening. Make sure this decision doesn't disappear from public consciousness. Second, contact your representatives. Call them, email them, show up at their offices if you have to. Tell them that withholding food from children is unacceptable. Tell them you're watching how they respond to this crisis. Third, find ways to help directly. Donate to local food banks. Volunteer at community kitchens. Support organizations working to feed families right now while we fight for systemic change. And finally, remember this moment. Remember how it felt to learn that 4 million children lost access to food because of a political decision. Remember that feeling when you vote. Remember it when you choose which leaders to support. Remember it when people try to tell you that politics don't matter. Because politics do matter, leadership matters. The choices we make about who represents us have real consequences for real people. And those consequences are being felt right now in households across America. This story isn't over. This decision can be reversed. This damage can be repaired, but only if we refuse to accept it as normal. Only if we keep fighting for something better. I still believe in America. I still believe in our capacity for compassion. I still believe that when Americans understand what's at stake, they choose love over fear, hope over despair, justice over convenience. But belief isn't enough. Hope isn't enough. We need action. We need commitment. We need you to stay engaged with this story until every one of those 4 million children has the food they need. Because they're not just numbers in a budget, they're not just collateral damage in a political strategy. They're our children, they're our future, they're our responsibility, and we will not let them down. We will not let their hunger be used as a weapon. We will not let their suffering be ignored. We are better than this. America is better than this, and together we're going to prove it. Subscribe, share, act. Remember, the children are counting on us, and we will not let them down. I'm Michelle Obama, and this is just the beginning of our fight for what's right.